The borders of the Roman Empire were extensive, very extensive, crossing more than 20 modern-day countries, 3 continents, and spanning over 75,000 kilometers or 46,000 miles. To guard this huge frontier, the Roman army had about 350,000 troops at their disposal. That might seem like a lot when all concentrated, but not so much when spread out. So the Romans had to come up with a smart idea to solve the puzzle that is border defense. And their solution was an intricate system of military installations placed at strategic locations and connected by roads. And in this video, we will take a look at one of the most important, but also totally overlooked military installations, the watchtowers.
I want to take a quick moment to tell you about today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a platform which offers all the tools you could ever need for creating, organizing and presenting complicated storylines, whether that be for a role-playing game, writing a novel, historical research or creating a game. World Anvil's most basic but essential function lets you create wiki-like pages. In this way you can build the core of your story, world or campaign. World Anvil offers way more functionalities though. For example, you can create complex family trees with backgrounds and images attached, calendars with important dates or well-structured timelines. Or, if you want to expand your world even further, you can upload any image and create your own detailed map, with points of interest and characters and places, then link them to other maps for a fully dynamic world, even down to the actual gaming board itself. And if you're more of a tag-along role-playing gamer like me, World Anvil is amazing to keep by your side as well, because it has all the rules for more than 80 of the most popular role-playing games, where you can build and keep track of your character and its stats, items, skills and resources, as well as the information the Game Master has granted you access to. So, if you're looking to create any sort of story or world, or enhance your role-playing experience, be sure to check out World Anvil. Visit worldanvil.com and use the code from the description below, Romanum, to get 51% off your yearly subscription.
Before we zoom in on the watchtower itself, we'll start with a short introduction to the system of Roman border defense in general. Up until the second half of the 1st century AD, many of the European borders were still young and fragile, and so the system of Roman border defense wasn't rigid either. For the defense of these borders up until the 1st century, the Romans relied in large part on allies to protect their own lands, with Roman forces being concentrated around single bigger fortifications in strategic locations somewhat further inland, and with few watchtowers around them to observe the surrounding area and communicate back to base. Starting from the end of the 1st century, we see a clear pattern of defensive structures being built along the edges of borders. Only some decades later, clearly structured defensive lines are in place all along the European northern border, including Britain. On the European mainland, the border mostly followed along the rivers Rhine and Danube, where the defenses consisted of watchtowers and garrison forts. The watchtowers were placed within eyesight of each other, usually roughly 500 meters apart, and the forts were manned by auxilia cohorts, units of 480 men, spaced out at an interval of roughly 10 to 15 kilometers. Such a line of watchtowers would not stand a chance against any invading force, if only because these watchtowers were most likely manned by just 4 to 6 soldiers each. But that was not the primary aim of these watchtowers. Their function was that of an alarm. They just needed to be alert and signal the nearest garrison fort for help as quickly as possible. To alert their comrades, the watchtower guards could light a signal fire, or perhaps even just blow a horn, if the wind was favorable. On Trajan's column, we can clearly see a watchtower with pyres of hay and wood next to it, and a lit torch at the top level of the tower, for quick access to fire. We also know that Romans were familiar with pigeon carriers, so it's very possible they held pigeons in or near the watchtower as well. But such major attacks would have been extremely rare, and not an everyday concern at all. Instead, one of the main daily purposes of any watchtower was to control and check the people and goods going in and out of the empire, as to control the trade and levy taxes, as well as prevent weapons from entering the empire, comparable to modern customs at an airport, for example. Now that we've discussed the basics, let's take a look at watchtowers themselves. This one right here is a reconstruction based on remains found just a few hundred meters away. But like with most things in the Roman army, there were no strict regulations on how things must be done, as long as it works. So naturally, there must have been a lot of diversity in watchtower design, and this is by no means the only right representation of a watchtower. Here in the Netherlands, for example, only wooden watchtower remains have been found, while in Germany, many stone watchtower remains have been found. The specific reason for this is probably the different types of soil. Here in the Netherlands, especially along the rivers, heavy structures would just sink into the soft, wet soil faster. And another thing that strikes us about this watchtower is that it is covered with loam on the outside, and the loam providing some much needed insulation for the cold winter months. From other Roman military structures, we know that it was a common building technique to fill the gaps in a wooden frame with wickerwork made of willow and then cover it in loam. At other watchtowers as well, many pieces of loam have been found, often with grooves in it, to make the loam resemble a stone wall, and possibly this is also what's shown on Trajan's column. For its defense, this watchtower has a particularly sturdy palisade wall, made of wooden poles placed upright in the ground. From researching the traces in the ground, we know this was actually rather rare for a watchtower. Most others either had just a fence made of willow wicker or nothing at all. What was standard is a moat. Pretty much every watchtower or fort had a moat. The dugout ground from the moat was often used for either an extra rampart or an overall elevation of the ground on which the tower stood. The watchtower that was found here even had wooden stakes in its moat, so this tower in particular was exceptionally well defended by Roman standards.
This watchtower has an entrance at the ground level, but it is thought many watchtowers had their entrance at the first floor, which was reached by a ladder on the inside that could be pulled in at night or in case of danger. The metal staircase on this tower is clearly not authentic. If a tower had its entrance on the ground level, like this one, a ladder would be a common element, as it's just such an easy and obvious way to hinder any possible attackers. A particularly small tower that was found in the Netherlands, which most likely only had a ground floor and a top floor, left clear signs of a fireplace at the ground level. The fact that many other found watchtowers don't have such a recognizable fireplace meant that their fireplace must have been off the ground, probably at the first floor instead of at ground level. And this makes sense too, as the room at the ground level is the coldest one in the tower because it's in direct contact with the ground and would be therefore best suited as a storage room, particularly for fresh food.
Fresh food would be all the things that the watchtower crew could gather in the direct vicinity of the tower. Here in the Netherlands, archaeology has shown that a lot of fish was eaten at these watchtowers, of course, since these towers were all situated along the River Rhine. Other fresh foods that were eaten include sweet and saltwater mussels, and all kinds of fruits, nuts and vegetables, and, not to forget, birds, especially ducks. All of these could be collected by the soldiers themselves or traded with the local population. For the core of their diet, the soldiers manning the watchtowers would have relied on supplies from the garrison fort nearby. Like for all Roman soldiers, the diet consisted mostly of grain and meat. The grain was handed out in its coarse and unground form and had to be grinded by the soldiers themselves. With the flour, they could make bread or porridge, the ultimate staples of the Roman diet. The bone fragments found around the watchtowers show that 85% of the consumed meat here was cattle, with the remainder being mostly goat and sheep and just a tiny fraction of pork. From the other sides and general knowledge of the Roman culinary taste, we know that Romans strongly preferred pork over cattle, whilst in the auxilia forts and indigenous settlements, cow bones are always far more dominant. These bone findings near watchtowers in the Netherlands suggest strongly that indeed it were local auxilia soldiers that manned the watchtowers and not legionaries. There is a clear argument for why the Romans would have picked auxilia soldiers over legionary soldiers to man the watchtowers. The reason being that many auxilia soldiers were recruited locally or stemmed from neighboring regions with at least somewhat similar cultures and languages. This would have been quite the advantage in their work as watchtower soldiers, which encompassed customs and police-like work as well. Not only did this mean they could actually communicate with the people they apprehended, but it also allowed them to connect to the people of the land much more easily, even make friends and start a family. This in turn made them more familiar with the local community and perhaps allowed them to pick up on the local gossip about brewing unrest on the other side of the border or some other suspicious activities. Also, the people would feel much less resentment towards soldiers of similar ethnicity and culture in comparison to those ill-reputed Romans. Sometimes though, the local auxilia soldiers would get a little bit too close to the civilian population and actually go along in the local unrest, not to say rebellion, projected towards the Romans. Such a thing happened right here in the Netherlands as well, resulting in a displacement of the remaining auxilia units to faraway places. But all in all, these kinds of instances were very rare. The first floor was basically where the soldiers lived when not on duty. It was where they slept, cooked, ate, played games and maintained their equipment. Towers were also often equipped with a simple kitchen, not much more than a small stove with a hole in the tower for the smoke to leave. Here, the soldiers could prepare a simple meal and the stove also functioned as a heat source in the colder months. So now let's go to the final floor where the action happened. Or rather, didn't. Because for 99% of the time, watchtower duty would have been little exciting, if not outright utterly boring, depending on the location of the watchtower. Watchtowers in the forest, in the middle of nowhere for example, would see little action on a daily basis. The men would wait around for that once-in-a-lifetime attack to happen. Mostly, they spent their time watching the clouds go by and chasing after the occasional forest spirit. For watchtowers in busier places, like along trading routes or at gates, they would at least have the local civilians to check, see what they're bringing with them, and inquire for the reasons for leaving or entering the empire. Watchtowers along rivers probably had similar responsibilities for the ships passing by. Rivers were the main transport routes of the day, and with the arrival of the Romans, the local economy and traffic suddenly got a major boost, as all these Roman soldiers and forts required large quantities of building materials, food, clothing, and equipment. Keeping the rivers safe, therefore, was an all-important task and something that required a lot of attention. Emperor Augustus installed a specific fleet for the safekeeping of the River Rhine, and the River Danube had its own naval units. The ships operated from auxilia forts along the river, and they must have had a tight cooperation with the auxilia soldiers manning the watchtowers, stemming from largely the same forts. From their platform high up, the watchmen would have a great vantage point to look out for suspicious vessels and odd behavior, no doubt pulling ships to the side and performing inspections from time to time. As we know, the watchtowers along the river were in each other's line of sight. They must have had a way to signal to the neighboring watchtower if a ship had been checked already or not, as to prevent ships being checked multiple times by different watchtower crews. Any pirates, smugglers of contraband or other unwanted guests would be arrested, placed in cuffs and taken to the local authorities for judgment. Most of the time, this would have been the local Roman military authorities. In case of serious hostilities, the watchtower men would signal for help, either for their neighboring watchtowers or their garrison unit further inland. Throughout Rome's history, there's many known examples of banditry and piracy that got way out of control and required serious military concerted efforts to beat down. Most of the times though, things were small scale and could be handled locally without assistance from higher up. Overall, life on the frontier was more of a police job than a soldier's job. However unimpressive in terms of their defensive capabilities, the watchtowers played a vital role in the well-thought-out system of Roman border defenses. They allowed the Romans to guard the border with minimal forces and ultimate efficiency, being able to overview virtually every stretch of the border and quickly call to action their garrison mother units. In itself, the endless chain of watchtowers and forts, spanning the entire width of the European mainland, must have been an intimidating sight for any enemy of Rome, and in that sense, it was a symbolic weapon too, a show of Rome's might right at the doorstep of its empire.